Hello everyone, my name is Advaith and welcome back to my channel, Subodha. Today, we'll be starting the third chapter in Class 8 History, that is, Ruling the Countryside. So, let's take a look at what we have ahead of us today in the form of this timeline. The parts which I've highlighted over here are the ones which we'll be covering today, and the rest will be covered in the next part of this series. So now, let's focus on the four major events that we'll be talking about today. First, we'll be talking about the takeover of the Diwani by the East India Company of the states of Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha in the year 1757. Then, we'll be talking about the Permanent Settlement Act in the year 1793, after which we'll discuss the Munro System in the year 1820, and finally, we'll be talking about 1822 when the Mahalwari system was introduced. So, without further ado, let's begin. So, first, let's zoom in on these specific parts of the timeline between 1757 and 1793, as you can see here. So, over here, a lot of events took place, and I'm going to explain them in the chronological order. So, basically, in 1757, the East India Company took over the Diwani of Bengal, which back then consisted of the states of Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha. So, what we have to understand over here is that, in spite of the fact that the company had now gained complete control over the region, they still considered themselves a trading company. Their major aim in those regions was just to gain as much profit from trade as possible. And so they did not want to expand and use their power too much. So that was the mentality of the East India Company. All they wanted was complete trade. Now, the first major event that we have to talk about is the Bengal Crisis. Let's talk about the events leading up to this first. Now, what we have to understand is that the East India Company, before this power, always used to import different sort of minerals from the United Kingdom. They used to bring in gold and silver, using which they would buy goods in India. But now they had complete control over the region, and all they had to do was ask for money and ask for products at lower prices. That's all they had to do to earn profits from trade. But these things had an interesting side effect. So, the first major event leading up to the crisis was the fact that artisans were now not willing to sell their produce for such a low price to the East India Company. I mean, why would they? After all, they've worked very, very hard to earn all of this. But the company still wanted them to sell these things at very, very low prices. When the artisans declined, the company began harassing them, which led to them deserting their villages and basically running away from all actions of the company. So there were basically no suppliers of artistic products to the East India Company. The second was the fact that now the East India Company was extracting taxes from peasants in that region, be it in the form of their produce or be it in the form of money. They were extracting large sums of money from the peasants. The peasants, however, were unable to pay such large amounts of taxes. After all, even they had to live, right? And because they were unable to pay all of these taxes, they too, just like the artisans had done before them, flew away and basically moved to different parts of the country. So now there was also no one to pay this money to the East India Company. The third was an unavoidable natural cause, which was basically a famine, one of the worst famines in the history of India, the Bengal famine of 1770. So all of these three events crippled the Bengal economy. And because of this, the company could no more carry on with its trade. And this was a huge problem. So, how did the company solve this? Well, that's the whole point of this chapter. We'll be looking at how the company solved these crises for themselves. So, let's zoom in at a different part of this timeline. Let's look at the events of 1793. Here, a new system was introduced in order to extract money and profits from the people in the states of Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha. This was the Permanent Settlement Act of 1793. So, what were the terms of this act? Well, it said that a fixed amount of revenue would be collected from each place in the state of Bengal. Here, the Rajas and the Talukdars would be identified as Zamindars. And the job of these Zamindars was to act as the mediator between the peasant who cultivated all of this and the East India Company who received the profits from all of this. So these Zamindars would collect revenues, a fixed revenue from these peasants and pay that to the East India Company. The reason it's called the Permanent Settlement Act is because, as you've just seen me explain, the rates of land were fixed permanently. That is, they could not be changed. So the company did this and it fixed this rate so that whenever the market was in crisis, there was no chance of the company's profits going down. At all points in time, the company's profits would remain stable. So, what could go wrong, right? Well, absolutely everything could go wrong. And let's look at exactly what went wrong over here. The first thing you have to understand is that the rates were fixed permanently. And because they were fixed permanently, when there was an up in the economy, that means when the Bengal economy was flourishing, they would still receive a fixed amount of revenue from the peasants. This actually meant that they were going to be at a loss. They were receiving less than what they were supposed to. This was evidenced in the early 19th century when the Bengal economy was actually flourishing. The problem was with this flourishing economy, the zamindars and the peasants were always at profit because they were receiving the right prices for what they were selling. The company, on the other hand, was only receiving a fixed revenue. Now, to explain this with an example, let's say the peasant is producing something that is worth about 2000 rupees. And the East India Company's fixed rate, let's say, is about 50% of it, half of it. So the peasant has produced 2000 rupees worth of produce, and 1000 of that is going to the company. Now let's keep this 1000 with the peasant, this 1000 rupees worth of produce with the peasant. Let's say tomorrow that the Bengal economy starts to flourish. Then this 1000 rupees worth of produce, its price will actually increase, let's say, to 2000 rupees. So now here the company has in any way received just 1000 rupees. In no way can it get more than that 1000 rupees. Whereas the peasant, instead of 1000 rupees, he's getting 2000 rupees, which is basically a double in his profit. Now let's say a quarter of this was going to go to the zamindar as a commission, let's say. The zamindar would take a quarter of the produce and sell it in the market. So if he was supposed to receive 500 rupees worth of produce, because of the flourishing economy, he would actually be able to sell these things for rupees 1000. So here, both the peasant and the zamindar were at profit, but the East India Company was not. So that was the first problem. Because of the fixed rates, the East India Company, regardless of how the economy was, received the same profits, which in most cases turned out to be negative for them. The second is the fact that these zamindars were extracting high amounts of rents from the peasants, some of which the peasants could not even pay. Now, according to the terms of the act, if someone could not pay the rent, then their lands would be auctioned off, which means they would be sold to other people. Because of this, there was no permanent peasant who resided on the land, which was a huge problem because then there would not be a cycle of continuous cultivation on the land, which would eventually lead to the depletion of the fertility of the land. And this was a massive problem for the East India Company. So, all of these problems led to the introduction of a new system called the Munro or the Rayatwari system in southern India. So, there were two changes from the Permanent Settlement Act in this system. The first was that land rates and revenue would not be fixed. That is, they would change based on the trend of the market. The second was that there was no concept of a zamindar. Rather, the taxes and the dues would be taken directly from the peasants themselves. And there was a strong reason for this. The person who introduced the system, that is Thomas Munro, believed that in southern India there was no concept of a traditional zamindar, and hence they had to protect the rights of the ryots, that is, the cultivators themselves. And because there were no zamindars, they had to directly communicate with these ryots. And they believed that by doing this, they were safeguarding their culture and hence were acting as father figures. So, little bit of a history about how this was introduced. In 1820, a man by the name of Captain Alexander Red began the system. He used the system in different places which were acquired from Tipu Sultan. As we saw in the previous chapter, when Tipu Sultan was defeated, the land was taken away from him and was given to the East India Company. Captain Alexander Red used these lands to experiment this new system called the Rayotwari system. Later, a few months later, a man by the name of Thomas Munro added a few new things to what Alexander Red had suggested, and he invented his own system, and hence that became the Munro system. So in 1820, the system was introduced. If in southern India there was the Rayatwari system, in northern India there was another system which went by the name of the Mahalwari system. Basically, it divided land on the basis of mahals, and a mahal in British times was a revenue estate, which was sort of a district, you could say, from which revenues would be collected. So that was the concept of a mahal. This system divided the land into mahals, and revenue would be collected from these mahals. Once again, there were two changes here from the Permanent Settlement Act. First was the fact that there were no zamindars in this case. Rather, the village headmen would collect revenues from the peasants and pay it to the East India Company. This is different from the Rayatwari system, as in the Rayatwari system we saw that there was no concept of a middleman at all. The peasants were directly paying their taxes to the East India Company. The second change was the fact that land revenue was not fixed. So, what they would do is they would send company officials to each of these mahals to inspect the land and to inspect the market. And based on that, rates would be changed so that the company would be profit when they had to and would be in loss when they had to, so that all of their revenue collection was justified. So, with this, we have finished the first part of this chapter. We have finished the first part of chapter 3, that is ruling the countryside. So, I hope that all of you understood all of these concepts, and I'll see you in part 2 of this chapter. Until then,